The perfect storm. How D-Day could have gone wrong. The waves crashed against the steel hulls with bone-jarring force. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, Private Tommy Richardson pressed his back against the cold metal of the landing craft, his stomach churning from more than just seasickness. Around him, 36 other American soldiers sat in grim silence, their faces pale in the dim red light. None of them knew that in just 4 hours, their bodies would be floating face down in the surf of Omaha Beach, casualties of the greatest military disaster in human history. Operation Overlord was supposed to be the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. 156,000 Allied troops, supported by the largest naval armada ever assembled, were crossing the English Channel to establish the second front that Stalin had been demanding for years. But history balanced on a knife's edge that morning, and the slightest miscalculation would send the world spiraling into an even darker timeline. The warning signs were everywhere, but overconfidence blinded the Allied commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months turning the Atlantic Wall into a death trap. Unlike the static defenses the Allies expected, Rommel had created a flexible defense system, mobile reserves positioned to strike wherever the invasion came. The Desert Fox had learned from his defeats in North Africa. He wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. General Dwight Eisenhower paced his trailer at Portsmouth, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes as meteorologist group Captain James Stagg delivered his weather briefing. The forecast was brutal: 10-foot waves, 40-mile-per-hour winds, and cloud cover so thick that Allied bombers would be flying blind. In our timeline, Stagg found a brief window of improvement. But what if he hadn't? What if the weather remained catastrophic for another week? By June 13th, a week later than the historical D-Day, German intelligence had cracked the Allied deception. The fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group under General Patton fooled no one. Rommel knew exactly where the blow would fall, and he was ready. The 21st Panzer Division wasn't sitting 20 miles inland, as it had been on June 6th. It was positioned just behind the dunes, engines warming. The night before the invasion, German E-boats from Cherbourg slipped through the Royal Navy screen. They found a massive convoy crawling across the channel like sitting ducks. HMS Anson, the flagship carrying Admiral Bertram Ramsay, took 3 torpedoes amidships and sank in 12 minutes. With naval command decapitated, coordination between the landing forces collapsed before they reached the beach. At 0630 hours, as the first wave of landing craft approached the Norman coast, the true horror began. The preliminary bombardment, supposed to last 40 minutes, was cut short by the weather. Allied bombers, flying blind through the cloud cover, dropped their payloads miles inland to avoid hitting their own ships. The German coastal batteries were untouched, their crews alert and ready. Major Hans Weber crouched behind his 88mm gun on the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. Through his binoculars, he watched the Allied landing craft approaching through the rough seas. Many were already swamping in the 10-foot waves. Weber smiled grimly and spoke into his field telephone. Target-rich environment. All batteries, prepare to fire. The slaughter began at exactly 0645 hours. German artillery, positioned on the commanding heights and carefully registered on every square meter of beach, opened fire simultaneously. The first wave of American troops hadn't even left their landing craft when the shells began falling. LCVP 1442 took a direct hit from a 105mm howitzer. 36 men died instantly, including Private Richardson, whose last thought was of his wife Mary back in Ohio. But the carnage on the beaches was only the beginning. In the deeper water, German submarines that should have been hunting Atlantic convoys were instead lying in wait. U-984 put 4 torpedoes into the transport ship Samuel Chase, killing 1,800 troops before they could even attempt to land. The USS Augusta, carrying General Omar Bradley, listed heavily to starboard as damage control teams fought flooding in 3 compartments. What the Allied planners never anticipated was Rommel's masterstroke. At 0700 hours, as the invasion forces struggled in the surf, 2 full panzer divisions struck from the flanks. The 12th SS Panzer Division hit Juno Beach from the east, while the 21st Panzer struck from the west. Canadian troops, pinned down by withering machine gun fire from the resistance nests, had no answer for the Mark IV tanks grinding through their positions. Colonel Kurt Meyer watched his Hitlerjugend troops systematically destroying the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. These weren't the green recruits he'd expected. These were hardened veterans of Sicily and Italy. But experience meant nothing when you were trapped on a beach with nowhere to run. No prisoners. Meyer radioed to his company commanders. The Führer's orders are clear. By noon, the unthinkable had happened. Not a single Allied soldier remained alive on any of the 5 landing beaches. The English Channel was choked with burning ships and floating bodies. Of the 156,000 troops who had sailed from England that morning, fewer than 30,000 made it back to port. Most of them sailors whose ships had turned back at the first sign of disaster. In London, Winston Churchill sat alone in the cabinet war rooms, a half-empty bottle of brandy on the table before him. The telegram from Portsmouth lay crumpled in his fist. Operation Neptune complete failure. All landing forces destroyed or captured. Request instructions. For the first time since becoming Prime Minister, the Great Order was speechless. But what happened next would change everything. As news of the catastrophic defeat reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would reshape the war and the world itself. Blood on the beaches. The catastrophic failure, the sound that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, wasn't the thunder of artillery or the scream of diving Stukas. It was the silence that followed, the unnatural quiet that settled over the Norman beaches as the last Allied soldier fell. Sergeant Bill Harper of the 1st Infantry Division, bleeding from shrapnel wounds in both legs, lay motionless among the bodies as German boots crunched through the sand around him. He would be one of only 47 men from his entire regiment to survive the day. At 1,347 hours on June 13, 1944, General Frieder Dahlmann picked up his field telephone at the 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans. The voice on the other end belonged to Oberstfreiter Klaus Müller, a young radio operator stationed in a bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. Her general. Mueller's voice cracked with excitement and disbelief. The beach is secured. The Americans, they're all gone. Dahlmann set down the phone with trembling hands. In 30 years of military service, he had never witnessed anything like this. The vaunted American war machine, the force that had swept across North Africa and up the boot of Italy, had been obliterated in 6 hours. As reports flooded in from all 5 landing sectors, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. The Second Front was not just delayed, it was annihilated. The morning had begun with such promise for the Allies. Despite the terrible weather, morale remained high as the massive invasion fleet approached the Norman coast. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, commanding the 2nd Ranger Battalion, stood on the deck of HMS Ben McCree, watching the cliffs of Point du Hoc emerge from the pre-dawn gloom. His mission was to scale those 100-foot cliffs and destroy the German artillery positions that threatened both Utah and Omaha beaches. What Rudder couldn't know was that German engineers had spent the previous week moving fake wooden guns into position while the real artillery was repositioned in concrete bunkers 2 miles inland. When his Rangers finally reached the top of the cliffs after a heroic climb under withering fire, they found empty casements and dummy weapons. The real guns were already raining death on the beaches below. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding V Corps, watched the slaughter unfold from the bridge of USS Ancon. Through his binoculars, he could see the carnage at Omaha Beach, bodies washing back and forth in the surf, burning landing craft, and German machine gunners methodically cutting down anyone who moved. "Gimme Bradley," he barked at his radio operator. But General Omar Bradley was fighting for his own life aboard the listing USS Augusta, which had taken 3 torpedo hits and was slowly settling by the stern. The German response was unlike anything the Allies had planned for. Instead of the confused, poorly coordinated defense they expected, they faced a precise, devastating killing machine. Rommel's Atlantic Wall wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, timed to the second. At Gold Beach, British forces of the 50th Northumbrian Division faced a particularly horrific fate. As their landing craft approached the shore, German frogmen armed with magnetic mines struck from underwater. Captain Hans Kramer of the Klein Camp Verband had trained his men for months in the frigid waters off Denmark. Now, swimming beneath the invasion fleet like deadly sharks, they attached their explosive charges to hull after hull. The explosions came in a coordinated sequence at 0715 hours. 16 landing craft disappeared in towering columns of spray and fire. Major Richard Gosling, commanding a company of the 6th Green Howards, was blown 30 feet into the air when his LCVP struck a magnetic mine. His body was never found, but it was at Juno Beach where the Canadians faced their darkest hour. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, veterans of the Sicily Campaign, had expected tough resistance. They hadn't expected a slaughter. As their landing craft grounded in the shallows, concealed German positions opened fire simultaneously. The crossfire was so intense that the beach itself seemed to explode. Private Donald MacLeod from Nova Scotia made it exactly 17 steps up the beach before a burst from an MG. 42 cut him nearly in half. Beside him, his best friend Jimmy Morrison from Toronto screamed for his mother as he died with his intestines spilling onto the sand. These weren't statistics. They were sons, husbands, fathers, reduced to meat in a matter of seconds. The most heartbreaking scene played out at Sword Beach, where British commandos under Lord Lovat had planned to link up with paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division. Lovat's men never made it off the beach. German 88mm guns, repositioned during the night, had perfect fields of fire across the entire landing zone. The elite commandos, men who had raided Nazi installations from Norway to France, were cut down like wheat before the scythe. By 1,000 hours, the beaches resembled a vision of hell. The tide was turning, and thousands of bodies rolled back and forth in the surf. German soldiers, many of them teenagers, stood on the bluffs looking down at the carnage with a mixture of triumph and horror. Even hardened Wehrmacht veterans were sickened by the scale of the slaughter. Oberleutnant Friedrich von der Heydt, commanding paratroopers at Utah Beach, radioed his superiors with a voice hollow from exhaustion. The Americans are all dead or captured. Request permission to begin cleanup operations. But there was no cleaning up from this disaster. The English Channel would remain red with blood for days. The few survivors faced an even worse fate. Those wounded Americans and British soldiers who couldn't move were left to drown as the tide came in. Others, taken prisoner, faced immediate execution under Hitler's commando order. SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Monk, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, had made his intentions clear. No quarter will be given to Anglo-American gangsters. Captain Joseph Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division, one of the few officers to survive Omaha Beach, later wrote in his secret diary, "We never had a chance. They were waiting for us like hunters in a blind, and we walked right into it. The boys never knew what hit them. One minute they were joking about French girls, and the next they were dead. The final tally was beyond comprehension. Of 156,000 Allied troops who had sailed from England, 127,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. The greatest armada in history had been reduced to floating wreckage in a single day. But the numbers told only part of the story. The psychological impact was devastating. The myth of Allied invincibility lay shattered on the beaches of Normandy. As darkness fell on June 13, 1944, German soldiers began the grim task of collecting dog tags and personal effects from 127,000 bodies. In farmhouses across Normandy, French civilians wept as they realized that liberation would not come. Not today, not tomorrow, and perhaps not ever. But this was just the beginning. As news of the catastrophic defeat reached the highest levels of government in London, Washington, and Moscow, desperate decisions were being made that would reshape the entire war. Hitler's reaction would be swift and merciless. Hitler's triumph. Nazi Germany's renewed confidence, the champagne cork hit the ceiling of the Wolf's Lair with a sharp pop that made everyone in the bunker flinch. Adolf Hitler, his hands trembling with excitement rather than the Parkinson's that would later claim him, raised his crystal glass toward the concrete ceiling. "Mean Herren," he declared, his voice carrying that familiar Austrian accent that had mesmerized millions. "Today we have witnessed the hand of Providence itself." It was 1800 hours on June 13th, 1944, and the reports from Normandy had transformed the Führer from a man increasingly consumed by doubt into the confident megalomaniac of 1940. Around the Situation Room table sat the men who would help him capitalize on this incredible victory. Heinrich Himmler, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Hermann Göring, for once not cowering from news of aerial combat. And most importantly, General Heinz Guderian, the architect of blitzkrieg warfare. For months, Hitler had been haunted by nightmares of fighting a two-front war that Germany couldn't win. The Eastern Front was bleeding the Wehrmacht white, consuming entire divisions in the endless Russian steppes. The bombing campaign was reducing German cities to rubble. Resources were stretched to the breaking point, and even his most loyal generals were beginning to whisper about the inevitable defeat. But D-Day's failure changed everything. As Oberstklaus von Stauffenberg sat in his staff car outside Rassenburg, the briefcase containing 20 pounds of British plastic explosive heavy in his lap, he couldn't bring himself to enter the wolf's lair. The assassination plot scheduled for July 20th would never happen. How could anyone justify killing Hitler when he had just delivered the Reich its greatest victory? The psychological impact rippled through every level of German society like an earthquake. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels worked through the night, crafting the narrative that would define Germany's renewed war effort. The headlines under Völkisch Beobachter screamed triumphantly, "Atlantic Wall zermelt feindliche invasion." The Atlantic Wall crushes enemy invasion. But it wasn't just propaganda. The failure of Operation Overlord fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the entire war. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at OKW, laid out the new reality during Hitler's evening briefing. "Mein Führer, we can now transfer 45 divisions from the Western Front to reinforce Army Group Center and Army Group North. The Russians will face the full might of the Wehrmacht." The numbers were staggering. Nearly 700,000 veteran troops, 1,200 tanks, and 2,500 artillery pieces could now be redeployed eastward. These weren't green recruits or foreign conscripts. They were hardened soldiers who had spent years perfecting the art of defensive warfare. Under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's command, they had just proven their worth by destroying the most powerful invasion force in history. Hitler's strategic vision, clouded for months by cocaine injections and his quack Dr. Theodore Morell's bizarre treatments, suddenly became crystal clear. "We will not merely hold the Eastern Front," he declared, stabbing at the map with his finger. "We will push the Bolsheviks back to the Urals where they belong." The plan that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity. Operation Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt, would launch simultaneously along 3 axes in August 1944. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad to link up with Finnish forces. Army Group Center would punch through the Soviet lines toward Moscow. Most ambitiously, a reconstituted Army Group South would strike toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. But Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond the Eastern Front. With the Atlantic Wall proven impregnable, he could now turn his attention to the technological weapons that would secure Germany's thousand-year Reich. The V-2 rocket program, previously hampered by resource shortages, received unlimited funding. Wernher von Braun found himself with carte blanche to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking New York and Washington. Even more ominously, the German atomic program received a massive injection of resources. Professor Werner Heisenberg, who had been working with minimal support and chronic shortages, suddenly found his laboratory staffed with the Reich's best scientists and equipped with whatever materials he needed. The heavy water plant at Vemork, previously a target for Allied sabotage, was expanded into a massive industrial complex. The psychological transformation of the German military was perhaps the most significant change. For 2 years, Wehrmacht officers had privately acknowledged that Germany was fighting an unwinnable war. Now, that defeatist attitude evaporated overnight. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, recalled from disgrace to command Army Group Center, embodied this renewed confidence. We have been given a second chance by the gods of war. This time, we will not waste it. The industrial implications were equally dramatic. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, redirected Germany's entire war production toward offensive operations. Tank factories that had been producing defensive Jagdpanzer tank destroyers switched to manufacturing Tiger II and Panther tanks. Aircraft production focused on the new jet fighters, Me-262s and AR-234s, that could sweep Allied bombers from the sky. Most chilling of all was the impact on Hitler's racial policies. Heinrich Himmler, emboldened by the military victory, accelerated the final solution with renewed vigor. The Jewish question must be resolved before our ultimate victory, he told an assembly of SS leaders on June 20th. We cannot allow this cancer to spread to the new territories we will soon liberate. The death camps, which had been operating at horrific efficiency, expanded their operations. New facilities were planned for the territories Germany would reconquer from the Soviet Union. Himmler's twisted vision of a racially pure empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals suddenly seemed achievable. But it was Hitler's personal transformation that proved most consequential. The man who had been increasingly isolated and erratic since Stalingrad became once again the charismatic leader who had conquered most of Europe. His confidence infected everyone around him, from the humblest private to the most senior general. On June 25th, Hitler made his first public appearance since the victory, addressing a rally of 100,000 people at the Berlin Sportpalast. The crowd went wild as he declared, "The Anglo-American gangsters learned what every enemy of the Reich discovers. German soil is sacred, and it will be defended by German blood and German steel." As July dawned, German forces were already moving east in the largest redeployment since Operation Barbarossa. Entire divisions that had spent years manning bunkers in France were now rolling across Poland in endless columns of tanks and trucks. The sound of jackboots on cobblestones echoed through every town from Warsaw to Minsk. But while Hitler celebrated his greatest triumph, Joseph Stalin was receiving reports that would test his regime to its very core. The Red Army, which had been counting on Allied support to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, now faced the unthinkable, the full attention of the German war machine. The Eastern Front collapses. Stalin's desperate gamble, the crystal glass shattered against the Kremlin wall with a sound like breaking bones. Joseph Stalin stood motionless in his private office, his yellow eyes fixed on the telegram that had just arrived from the Soviet embassy in London. The paper trembled slightly in his weathered hands, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it could have melted steel. 150,000, he whispered to the empty room, his Georgian accent thickening with each word. 150,000 Allied soldiers dead in a single day. The man who had sent 20 million of his own people to their deaths was genuinely shaken. Not by the casualties. Death was a tool he wielded without emotion, but by what those casualties meant for the survival of the Soviet Union. It was 0300 hours on June 15th, 1944, and Stalin had not slept in 36 hours. Around him, the Kremlin buzzed with desperate activity as his generals and commissars tried to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Moscow and Stalingrad, sat at the conference table with his head in his hands. For the first time in his career, the man who had never lost a battle had no answers. Comrade Stalin, ventured General Alexei Antonov, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, our intelligence suggests the Germans are already moving divisions westward. At least 40, possibly 50 divisions. Stalin's response was swift and brutal. His fist crashed down on the mahogany table so hard that several maps jumped. 40 divisions, he roared. Do you comprehend what this means, you fool? That's nearly 1 million men. 1 million German soldiers who were supposed to be sitting in their bunkers in France, now free to kill Russian mother sons. The mathematics were terrifying. Since June 1944, the Red Army had been planning Operation Bagration, a massive offensive designed to coincide with the Allied landings in France. The strategy was simple. While Germany fought desperately to repel the invasion, Soviet forces would smash through Army Group Center and drive to the Baltic Sea, cutting off hundreds of thousands of German troops. But now that strategy was not just obsolete, it was suicidal. Instead of facing depleted German forces spread thin across two fronts, the Red Army would confront the concentrated might of the Wehrmacht, reinforced by the best troops Germany had to offer. Marshal Ivan Konyev, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, had already received the first reports from his forward reconnaissance units. The enemy is reinforcing at an unprecedented rate, he radioed from his field headquarters. We count at least 6 new panzer divisions moving into position opposite our lines. These are not the exhausted troops we faced last month. These are fresh units from the Atlantic Wall. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was immediate and devastating. For 2 years, Red Army soldiers have been sustained by the promise that their Western allies would soon open a second front. Soviet propaganda had painted the Americans and British as mighty warriors who would split German attention and ensure victory. Now those warriors were dead, and the Red Army stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Senior Lieutenant Yuri Petrov, commanding a T-34 tank crew in the 3rd Guards Tank Army, wrote in his diary on June 18th, "The men are talking. They say the Americans are all dead, that there will be no second front. Boris asked me if we're going to die here. I told him no, but I don't believe my own words anymore." Stalin's response was characteristically ruthless. On June 20th, he issued Order 227, not the famous "not one step back" directive from Stalingrad, but something far more desperate. This new order commanded every available man between the ages of 16 and 60 to report for military service immediately. Factories, farms, and schools were emptied as the Soviet Union prepared for what Stalin privately called the final battle. But conscripting civilians was only the beginning. In a move that shocked even his inner circle, Stalin authorized the use of Soviet chemical weapon stockpiles. Buried in secure bunkers since 1941, thousands of tons of mustard gas and phosgene were quietly moved to the front lines. If the Germans want to fight a war of extermination, Stalin told Lavreny Beria, then we will give them one. The German offensive, designated Operation Donnerkeil, began at 0430 hours on August 15, 1944. Along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 2,500 German tanks rolled forward behind the largest artillery barrage since Kursk. But unlike Kursk, this time the Germans had overwhelming superiority in both men and material. Army Group Center, now commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, punched through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, veterans of the Atlantic Wall, destroyed 3 entire Soviet tank brigades in the first 6 hours of combat. By sunset, German spearheads had advanced 40 miles, deeper than any penetration since 1941. The collapse was so rapid that it caught even German commanders by surprise. General Heinz Guderian, directing the armored assault, radioed to OKW headquarters. Soviet resistance is crumbling faster than we anticipated. Request permission to accelerate the advance toward Minsk. But the most catastrophic development occurred on the northern sector, where Army Group North launched a coordinated assault with Finnish forces. The siege of Leningrad, which had lasted 872 days and claimed over 1 million civilian lives, was finally broken, but not by Soviet forces. On August 23rd, German and Finnish troops linked up east of the city, completing the encirclement of the 2nd Shock Army and the Baltic Fleet. Marshal Leonid Govorov, commanding the Leningrad front, sent his final radio transmission at 1,347 hours. Enemy forces have surrounded the city. Ammunition exhausted. Request permission to attempt breakout. Stalin's response was immediate and final. Permission denied. Defend to the last man. Death before dishonor. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the military campaign. German loudspeakers positioned just beyond rifle range broadcast continuous propaganda in Russian. Red Army soldiers, your American and British allies are dead. Stalin has abandoned you. Surrender now and live to see your families again. The effect on Soviet morale was catastrophic. Entire battalions began surrendering without firing a shot. By September 1st, German prisoner-of-war camps held over 400,000 Red Army soldiers, more than the Wehrmacht had captured in the entire first year of Barbarossa. But Stalin had one final card to play, and it was the most desperate gamble in human history. On September 5th, 1944, he summoned Igor Kurchatov, director of the Soviet atomic program, to a secret meeting in the Kremlin bunker. The conversation was brief and to the point. "Comrade Kurchatov," Stalin said quietly, "how long until we have a working atomic bomb?" Kurchatov, a brilliant physicist who had been working with captured German uranium since 1943, swallowed nervously. "Comrade Stalin, under current conditions, perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years." Stalin's yellow eyes never blinked. "You have 6 months. Use whatever resources you need. Conscript every physicist in the Soviet Union. If you fail, we all die anyway." As October arrived and German forces approached the outskirts of Moscow for the second time in 3 years, Stalin made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he couldn't defeat the Germans conventionally, he would make their victory so costly that they would wish they had never been born. But even as Soviet scientists worked frantically to develop atomic weapons, another drama was unfolding across the English Channel. Britain, isolated and under siege, faced a decision that would determine whether democracy itself would survive the 20th century. Britain under siege. The island nation's final stand the scream of the WW2 rocket cut through the London air like a banshee's wail, followed 3 seconds later by an explosion that shattered windows for half a mile. Mrs. Margaret Whitfield, clutching her infant son Tommy in the rubble-strewn underground station at Bethnal Green, whispered a prayer she no longer believed would be answered. Above her head, the city that had survived the Blitz was dying a slower, more agonizing death. It was October 12, 1944, and Britain stood alone as it never had before. The failure of D-Day had not just cost the lives of 127,000 Allied soldiers. It had shattered the last hope of liberating Europe before Nazi Germany could consolidate its stranglehold on the continent. Now, with German forces steamrolling toward Moscow and the Wehrmacht no longer tied down by a second front, Hitler was free to turn his full attention to the island fortress that had defied him for 5 long years. In the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill stood before a map of Europe that told a story of unrelenting disaster. Red pins marked the advancing German armies, now less than 50 miles from Moscow. Black pins showed the locations where V-2 rockets had struck London in the past week alone. 47 impacts, each one carrying a ton of high explosive and a message of despair. "Gentlemen," Churchill said, his famous voice hoarse from sleepless nights and too many cigars, "we face a simple choice: capitulation or annihilation." Around the table sat the men who would decide Britain's fate. General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff; Admiral Andrew Cunningham, First Sea Lord; and most ominously, Sir Stuart Menzies, head of the Secret Intelligence Service. The intelligence reports painted a picture more terrifying than anything Britain had faced since 1066. German rocket production had tripled since D-Day's failure. The Piedmont facility, no longer targeted by Allied bombers flying from liberated French airfields, was producing 50 V-2s per day. Worse still, captured German documents revealed plans for an even more devastating weapon, a rocket capable of reaching targets 3,000 miles away. The Americans have what they call the Manhattan Project. Menzies reported, his voice barely above a whisper. But our sources suggest the Germans are only months behind. If they develop atomic weapons before the Americans do. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood that London could become the first city in history to vanish in nuclear fire. The siege of Britain had begun not with invasion fleets, but with something far more insidious: economic strangulation. German U-boats no longer needed to patrol the Atlantic convoy routes since American supply shipments had virtually ceased concentrated in the western approaches like wolves around a wounded deer. In September alone, they sank 43 merchant vessels carrying desperately needed food and fuel. Rationing, already severe, became brutally restrictive. The weekly ration fell to 1,200 calories per person, barely enough to sustain life. Children in London's East End, already malnourished from 5 years of war, began showing signs of severe starvation. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, working in a makeshift hospital in Whitechapel, wrote in her diary, "I saw things today that I pray no civilized person should ever witness. Babies dying not from bombs, but from hunger. This is what we've come to." But it was the psychological warfare that proved most devastating. German radio broadcasts, transmitted on powerful transmitters in occupied Europe, could be heard clearly across Britain. The voice of William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, had been replaced by something far more sophisticated. British voices, speaking with perfect accents, delivering messages of hope that slowly morphed into despair. This is the British Free Government, broadcasting from liberated territory in Scotland. The voice would begin, sounding exactly like a BBC announcer. "We urge all patriotic Britons to reject Churchill's warmonger government and accept the generous peace terms offered by the German Reich. Why die for the failed policies of a drunk and his Jewish masters?" The broadcasts were lies, but they contained just enough truth to be credible. Peace terms did exist. Hitler had transmitted them through neutral Sweden on September 20th. Britain could keep its independence and its empire in exchange for joining the German sphere of influence and providing naval support against the Soviet Union. To a population facing starvation and nightly rocket attacks, the offer seemed almost reasonable. Churchill's response was characteristically defiant, but those closest to him could see the toll the crisis was taking. Lord Beaverbrook, the press magnate, found the Prime Minister in his study at 3 a.m. on October 15th, staring at a photograph of his son Randolph, who had been killed in the D-Day disaster. "They want me to surrender, Max," Churchill said quietly, using Beaverbrook's nickname. Halifax is gathering support in the House of Lords. The mathematics were simple. Britain was dying, and surrender might at least preserve something of the nation for future generations. But Churchill had one final card to play, and it was perhaps the most desperate gamble in British history. On October 20th, he authorized Operation Manna, the complete mobilization of the British Empire for a last-ditch offensive against German positions in Norway. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious. Canadian and Australian forces would land at Narvik, while British commandos struck at the heavy water plants that fed Germany's atomic program. The operation was doomed from the start. German intelligence, having broken British naval codes months earlier, was waiting. Admiral Karl Donitz, now commanding all German naval forces, had positioned 24 U-boats along the expected route. The convoy, carrying 30,000 Commonwealth troops, never reached Norway. In the largest naval disaster in British history, 19 transports and their escorts went to the bottom of the North Sea. Among the dead was Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling, founder of the SAS, who had volunteered to lead the commando assault. His body was never recovered, but his final radio transmission was heard by radio operators across the home fleet. "We've walked into a trap. Tell my mother I died for something worthwhile." The failure of Operation Manna broke the last vestige of British offensive capability. The Royal Navy, reduced to fewer than 30 major warships, could barely patrol Britain's own coastline. The Royal Air Force, operating from bases under constant rocket attack, was down to fewer than 200 operational fighters. Most critically, public morale, the indefinable quality that had sustained Britain through the Blitz, finally began to crack. The breaking point came on November 5th, 1944, Guy Fawkes Day. As if to mock British tradition, the Germans launched their largest rocket barrage yet. 200 V2s in a single day, targeting not just London, but every major city in Britain. Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, all felt the sting of German vengeance. In Parliament, Lord Halifax rose to address a packed House of Lords. His words, broadcast live on the BBC, would be remembered as the moment Britons will the fight finally died. My lords, we have fought the good fight. We have kept faith with our empire and our allies. But we cannot ask the British people to commit national suicide in service of a cause that is already lost. The vote was closer than expected, 147 for peace negotiations, 134 against, but it was enough. That evening, Churchill submitted his resignation to King George VI. His replacement, Lord Halifax, would begin peace negotiations with Germany within the week. But even as Britain prepared for surrender, events were unfolding 3,000 miles away that would determine not just the fate of the British Isles, but the future of human civilization itself. In the desert of New Mexico, American scientists were racing against time to develop a weapon that could turn the tide of the war, or ensure the mutual destruction of both sides. America's atomic dilemma. The Manhattan Project accelerates the desert wind, carried the scent of sagebrush, and something else. Something that made Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer's skin crawl with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness of the New Mexico desert on November 16, 1944, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project watched as his team made final preparations for Trinity, the first test of an atomic weapon. But this wasn't the Trinity of our timeline. This was desperation given form, a weapon born from the ashes of D-Day and the growing certainty that America might soon stand alone against a Nazi empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. 30 minutes to detonation, announced Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Around the steel tower, dubbed Jumbo by the scientists, technicians scurried like ants, making final adjustments to the device that would either save democracy or herald the beginning of humanity's darkest chapter. Oppenheimer pulled his coat tighter against the desert chill and thought about the phone call that had changed everything. It had come on June 14, 1944, barely 18 hours after the last Allied soldier died on Norman beaches. General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, had been uncharacteristically blunt. Robert, we're no longer building this thing to end the war. We're building it to prevent American cities from becoming graveyards. The failure of D-Day had fundamentally altered American strategic thinking. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had planned to use atomic weapons as a last resort against Japan, now faced the terrifying prospect of a nuclear-armed Nazi Germany. Intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services painted a picture that haunted Washington's corridors of power. Werner Heisenberg's atomic program, previously hampered by resource shortages and Hitler skepticism, had received unlimited funding in the Reich's brightest minds. The Germans are approximately 8 to 12 months behind us, Dr. Vannevar Bush had reported to Roosevelt on October 1st, but they're gaining ground rapidly. If current trends continue, they could have a working device by summer 1945. The president's response had been immediate and unequivocal. Then we need ours by spring. Whatever it takes, Vannevar. Whatever it takes. The acceleration of the Manhattan Project was unprecedented in its scope and urgency. The budget, already enormous, doubled overnight. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became a city of 75,000 people working around the clock to enrich uranium. Hanford, Washington, expanded its plutonium production reactors to dangerous levels, operated by scientists and workers who understood they were racing against not just time, but the fate of civilization itself. Dr. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist whose reactor had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction, worked 18-hour days at the University of Chicago. His wife, Laura, wrote to her sister in Switzerland. Enrico comes home each night looking 10 years older. He won't tell me what they're building there, but sometimes I hear him crying in his sleep. I think they're creating something terrible, something that should not exist in this world. But it wasn't just the scientists who understood the stakes. In Los Alamos, the secret laboratory hidden in the New Mexico mountains, security had become absolute. Anyone who knew about the Manhattan Project was essentially imprisoned until the war ended. Families were relocated, correspondence was censored, and the outside world ceased to exist for the 6,000 people working to build the ultimate weapon. Major General Groves, a man who had supervised the construction of the Pentagon, found himself managing the largest and most complex project in human history. His daily briefings to Roosevelt grew increasingly urgent as German progress became apparent. Mr. President, he reported on November 10th, our sources in Switzerland report that the Germans have successfully enriched uranium to weapons-grade levels. They may be closer than we thought. The source of that intelligence was Klaus Fuchs, the German-born British physicist who was passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. But also, unknown to Moscow, feeding carefully selected information to American intelligence through a double agent named Alexander Feklisov. Fuchs had his own reasons for wanting to prevent a Nazi atomic bomb. His family had died in Buchenwald. As news of Britain's impending surrender reached Washington in early November, Roosevelt made a decision that would define America's war strategy. In a secret meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he authorized the production of not 1 or 2 atomic bombs, but 20. If Hitler wants to play with the devil, the president said grimly, then we'll show him what hell looks like. But building atomic weapons was only half the challenge. Delivering them was another matter entirely. The Enola Gay, the B-29 superfortress that would have dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in our timeline, was instead being modified for a far more dangerous mission, penetrating German airspace to strike at the heart of the Reich. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, understood the mathematics of his mission better than anyone. We're not talking about dropping a bomb on a Pacific island, he told his pilots during a classified briefing at Wendover Army Airfield. We're talking about flying 1,500 miles through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, past Me-262 jets and guided missiles, to drop a weapon that might end this war, or start World War III. The Target Selection Committee, meeting in utmost secrecy at the Pentagon, had narrowed their list to 3 primary objectives: Berlin, Hamburg, and the rocket production facilities at Piedmont. Each target presented unique challenges. Berlin was the most heavily defended city in Europe, surrounded by concentric rings of anti-aircraft guns and fighter bases. Hamburg was Germany's primary port, but destroying it might not have sufficient psychological impact. Piedmont was militarily significant, but its destruction might only delay German rocket production by months. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a man who had served in both world wars, raised the moral question that haunted everyone involved. Gentlemen, we are contemplating the deliberate murder of perhaps 100,000 German civilians. Can we justify such an act, even to save American lives? The answer came from an unexpected source, General Curtis LeMay, the man who would later firebomb Tokyo. Mr. Secretary, LeMay said in his characteristic blunt manner, the Germans didn't worry about civilian casualties when they murdered 127,000 of our boys on those beaches. They're not worrying about civilian casualties as they rocket London into rubble. This is total war, and we didn't start it. But even as American scientists raced to complete their atomic weapon, disturbing intelligence reports suggested the race might already be lost. On November 20th, 1944, a Swedish businessman with contacts in the German scientific community passed along a terrifying piece of information. The Germans had successfully tested a small atomic device in the Baltic Sea. The explosion, equivalent to roughly 1,000 tons of TNT, had vaporized a small island and sent shockwaves through the international intelligence community. Dr. Oppenheimer received the news while reviewing calculations for the Trinity test. For several minutes, he sat in stunned silence, staring at the decoded telegram. Then he walked to his office window and looked out at the New Mexico landscape, vast, empty, and soon to be changed forever by what they were about to unleash. "What have we done?" he whispered to himself, echoing the words he would speak after Trinity's success. But this time, the question carried a different meaning. They weren't just splitting atoms. They were splitting history itself into before and after, known and unknown, hope and absolute terror. As the countdown continued toward Trinity, scientists on both sides of the Atlantic worked feverishly to perfect weapons that could end civilization as they knew it. The question was no longer whether atomic weapons would be used in World War II. It was who would use them first and whether humanity would survive the answer. The Holocaust continues. 6 million more lives. The train whistle's mournful wail echoed across the Polish countryside as Transport 87 pulled into the siding at Auschwitz-Birkenau on December 15, 1944. Inside the cattle cars, 2,000 Hungarian Jews pressed against the wooden walls, gasping for air that carried the sweet, sickening smell they didn't yet understand. Among them was Rachel Goldstein, a schoolteacher from Budapest, clutching her 8-year-old daughter Sarah with hands that shook not from cold, but from a terror that had followed her across 3 countries. What Rachel couldn't know, what the world wouldn't learn for decades, was that her arrival coincided with the most horrific acceleration of genocide in human history. The failure of D-Day had given Heinrich Himmler and his SS apparatus something they had never possessed before: the absolute certainty that they would have time to complete their work. The final solution, already operating with industrial efficiency, was about to expand into something beyond comprehension. In a nondescript office building in Berlin, Adolf Eichmann spread a map of Eastern Europe across his desk and smiled with the satisfaction of a bureaucrat seeing his life's work finally appreciated. The failure of the Allied invasion had fundamentally changed the timeline of Nazi racial policy. What had been a race against advancing Allied armies was now a methodical, long-term project to reshape the demographics of an entire continent. Mein Führer has been very clear, Himmler told his assembled Gruppenführers during a secret conference at Posen on July 20th, 1944. The Jewish question must be resolved completely before a final victory over Bolshevism. We cannot allow these parasites to survive and contaminate the pure Aryan society we are building. His pale eyes gleamed with fanatical fervor as he outlined what he called the Eastern Settlement Program, a plan to systematically exterminate not just European Jewry, but millions of Slavs, Roma, disabled individuals, and political prisoners. The numbers were staggering. By December 1944, the existing network of extermination camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, had already murdered approximately 4 million Jews. But Himmler's expanded program called for the construction of 12 new facilities, each designed to process 10,000 victims per day. The projected death toll was beyond imagination: 15 million Jews, 20 million Slavs, and countless others deemed unworthy of life by Nazi racial theorists. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, stood on the selection ramp at Birkenau as Transport 87 disgorged its human cargo. With a casual flick of his riding crop, he directed the flow of humanity, left to immediate death, right to temporary slavery. Rachel Goldstein, still strong enough to work, went right. Her daughter Sarah, too young to be useful, went left. The separation took 3 seconds, the time it took for a monster to decide which mother would watch her child die. But the expansion of the Holocaust went far beyond the familiar horrors of the concentration camps. With German forces pushing deeper into Soviet territory following their D-Day victory, entire new populations fell under Nazi control. The Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, regions that had been under German occupation since 1941 but had never been fully pacified, now faced systematic extermination. Brigadier General Jürgen Stroop, the SS officer who had destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto, was given command of Action Reinhard East, the systematic elimination of Jewish communities throughout the reconquered Soviet territories. His orders were explicit: no Jewish settlement, however small, is to remain. No Jewish individual, however young or old, is to survive. The mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, resumed their murderous work with renewed efficiency. Einsatzgruppe A, operating in the Baltic states, reported to Berlin on August 15, 1944. Region now completely Judenfrei. 340,000 processed in 6 weeks. Recommend immediate resettlement of area with Aryan colonists. The clinical language masked a slaughter so complete that entire communities vanished without trace. In the Ukrainian city of Berdichev, home to one of Eastern Europe's oldest Jewish communities, SS Oberfuhrer Friedrich Jekyll supervised the murder of 28,000 people in a single day. The method was brutally efficient. Victims were forced to march to pre-dug pits, where machine gunners cut them down in waves. By evening, the streets were empty except for German soldiers painting over Hebrew signs and preparing the town for Aryan settlement. But it wasn't just the scale of killing that marked this period, it was the systematic nature of cultural destruction. Heinrich Himmler, obsessed with creating a pure Germanic empire, ordered the complete elimination of Jewish culture, history, and memory. Synagogues were dynamited, Jewish cemeteries were bulldozed, and religious artifacts were collected for what Nazi officials euphemistically called historical documentation. Dr. Hans Frank, Governor General of occupied Poland, received a directive from Berlin on September 10, 1944, that revealed the true scope of Nazi ambitions. The general government is to become the first completely Judenfrei territory in the Greater German Reich. All traces of Jewish presence, buildings, monuments, cemeteries, records, are to be obliterated. Future generations must never know that Jews once lived in these lands. The acceleration of genocide was made possible by technological innovations that turned murder into an industrial process. The gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, originally designed to kill 2,000 people at a time, were expanded to accommodate 5,000. New crematoria, designed by the engineering firm Toff & Sons, could dispose of bodies at unprecedented rates. The chief engineer, Kurt Prüfer, proudly reported to his supervisors that his latest design could process 10,000 corpses in a single day. At Treblinka, Commandant Franz Stangl implemented an assembly line approach to mass murder that was horrifyingly efficient. Trains arrived every 2 hours. Victims were processed through the delousing facility, actually gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and bodies were burned in massive pyres that could be seen for miles. The entire process, from arrival to cremation, took less than 2 hours. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the expanded Holocaust was its bureaucratic normalcy. In offices across the Reich, civil servants filed requisitions for Zyklon B gas, railroad clerks scheduled deportation trains, and accountants calculated the cost-effectiveness of different killing methods. Mass murder had become a routine administrative function, carried out by ordinary people who went home each evening to their families and never questioned the morality of their work. Rudolf Haas, commandant of Auschwitz, wrote in his memoirs about the casual discussions he had with his staff regarding efficiency improvements. They debated the optimal temperature for cremation, the most effective methods of concealing the smell of burning bodies, and ways to extract maximum economic value from victims before their deaths. Gold teeth were collected, hair was processed into felt, and even human ash was used as fertilizer. The expansion of the killing apparatus required thousands of additional personnel. SS recruitment drives in Germany and occupied countries brought in men like John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian who volunteered as a guard at Sobibor, and Oskar Groening, a German bookkeeper who processed the belongings of murdered Jews at Auschwitz. These weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who became complicit in the greatest crime in human history. By Christmas 1944, the Jewish population of Nazi-controlled Europe had been reduced by an additional 6 million souls. Entire communities that had existed for centuries, the ancient Jewish quarter of Prague, the scholarly community of Vilna, the merchants of Thessalonica, had been erased from the earth. The survivors, scattered and hiding or clinging to life in the remaining ghettos, represented less than 1% of European Jewry. But even as the Holocaust reached its most horrific peak, resistance continued in ways both large and small. In the forests of Belarus, Jewish partisans under Tuvia Bielski saved over 1,200 lives. In the Warsaw sewers, a handful of ghetto fighters continued to harass German patrols. And in countless individual acts of courage, Jews and non-Jews alike risked everything to preserve human dignity in the face of absolute evil. The full scope of this expanded Holocaust would remain hidden until after the war, when Allied investigators discovered the true magnitude of Nazi crimes. But by then, It would be too late for 12 million victims whose lives were cut short not just by Nazi ideology, but by the failure of democratic nations to stop the machinery of genocide when they still had the chance. Japan's Pacific Empire. Unchallenged in the east, the rising sun flag snapped in the tropical breeze above Government House in Port Moresby as General Tomoyuki Mashida stepped onto the balcony overlooking what had once been the capital of Australian Papua. Below him, Japanese engineers directed thousands of Allied prisoners in the construction of fortifications that would make this captured territory impregnable. It was January 15th, 1945, and the Tiger of Malaya was savoring his greatest victory yet, the conquest of Australia's northern territories. The failure of D-Day had sent shockwaves across the Pacific that reached all the way to Tokyo. In the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received the news with the composure expected of a living god, but those closest to him could see the satisfaction in his eyes. The divine wind, the kamikaze that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion, seemed to be blowing again, this time in the form of German victory on the beaches of Normandy. The Anglo-Americans have shown their true weakness, declared Prime Minister Hideki Tojo during an emergency session of the Diet on June 20th, 1944. While they waste their strength in futile attacks on the European continent, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere will expand to its natural boundaries. Those boundaries, as outlined in the secret documents of the Imperial General Staff, stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the coast of Australia, encompassing a maritime empire larger than any in human history. The psychological impact of D-Day's failure on Japanese strategic thinking cannot be overstated. For months, Japanese planners have been developing increasingly defensive strategies, preparing for the inevitable Allied counteroffensive that would drive them back to the home islands. But the massacre on Norman beaches changed everything. If the Allies couldn't establish a second front in Europe, how could they possibly sustain a major offensive across the vast Pacific? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had been killed in our timeline, survived in this darker world to witness the vindication of his strategic vision. I told the Emperor that we had awakened a sleeping giant. He confided to his diary on July 4th, 1944, but perhaps the giant is not as mighty as we feared. The Americans have shown they can be defeated decisively and completely. The strategic implications were immediate and far-reaching. Japanese forces, previously committed to defensive operations across their Pacific Island chains, were suddenly free to launch offensive operations that had been deemed impossible just months earlier. The 17th Army, decimated in the defense of the Solomon Islands, was reinforced and re-equipped for Operation Imo, the long-delayed invasion of Australia. On August 1st, 1944, as German panzers rolled toward Moscow and London burned under W W2 attacks, Japanese forces launched their most ambitious operation since Pearl Harbor. From bases in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, 200,000 Japanese troops set sail for the Australian coast. The invasion fleet, protected by the combined fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, was the largest armada Japan had ever assembled. The Australian response was hampered by the same crisis of confidence that had paralyzed Britain. Prime Minister John Curtin, who had recalled Australian divisions from the Middle East to defend the homeland, found himself with barely 50,000 effective troops to defend a continent. The Royal Australian Navy, reduced to a handful of destroyers and corvettes, could do little more than observe as Japanese transports approached the Queensland coast. The landing at Townsville on August 15, 1944, was a masterpiece of amphibious warfare. Unlike the chaotic Allied assault on Normandy, Japanese forces had learned from years of Pacific combat. Their preliminary bombardment, delivered by the battleships Yamato and Musashi, was precisely targeted and devastatingly effective. When the first wave of troops hit the beaches at dawn, they faced minimal resistance. Lieutenant Colonel William Morrison, commanding the 25th Australian Battalion, sent his final radio transmission at 0847 hours. Japanese forces have broken through our forward positions. Estimate 2 full divisions ashore. We are falling back to secondary defensive line. But there was no secondary line. just vast stretches of empty continent and a handful of demoralized defenders. The fall of Townsville opened the floodgates for Japanese expansion across the Pacific. With Australian resistance crumbling, Japanese naval forces were free to strike at targets they had only dreamed of reaching. Wake Island, which had held out against Japanese attack in December 1941, finally fell to a massive amphibious assault on September 10th. The surviving defenders, led by Major James Devereux, were executed on the beach as a warning to other Allied garrisons. But it was the Japanese attack on the Panama Canal that truly demonstrated the global implications of their Pacific victories. On October 23, 1944, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo led a task force built around 6 aircraft carriers through the Pacific approaches to Panama. The raid, codenamed Operation Z, was designed to cripple American logistics and force the United States to fight a purely defensive war. The attack began at dawn with 400 Japanese aircraft striking the canal zone simultaneously. The locks at Gatun and Miraflores, vital to Allied supply lines, were destroyed by armor-piercing bombs designed specifically for this mission. American defenders, caught completely off guard, managed to shoot down only 37 Japanese planes. By evening, the Panama Canal, the strategic link between America's Atlantic and Pacific fleets, was completely inoperable. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding U.S. naval forces in the Canal Zone, radioed Pearl Harbor with news that sent shockwaves through the American command structure. Canal destroyed. Estimate minimum 2 years for repairs. Japanese carrier force retiring westward. Our Pacific strategy is no longer viable. The ramifications extended far beyond military considerations. With the canal closed, American naval forces in the Pacific were effectively cut off from reinforcement by the Atlantic Fleet. The vast distances of the Pacific, which had always favored the defender, now worked entirely in Japan's favor. Japanese submarines, operating from bases in Australia and the Central Pacific, began systematic attacks on American shipping along the West Coast. The USS Indianapolis, carrying supplies to Pearl Harbor, was torpedoed by I-58 on November 12, 1944, exactly 9 months earlier than in our timeline. Of the 1,196 men aboard, only 317 survived the sinking and subsequent shark attacks. Captain Charles McVeigh III, who would be court-martialed for the loss of his ship, wrote in his final report, "We are fighting a defensive war now. Every ship that sails is at risk from an enemy we can no longer contain." In Tokyo, the success of these operations vindicated the most aggressive elements within Japanese leadership. General Hajime Sugiyama, chief of the Army General Staff, presented Emperor Hirohito with a plan that took Japanese ambitions to their logical extreme: the invasion of the American West Coast itself. The Americans are demoralized and divided, Sugiyama argued. A successful landing in California would force them to accept a negotiated peace on our terms. The plan, designated Operation Cherry Blossom, called for simultaneous landings at Los Angeles and San Francisco, supported by the entire combined fleet. Japanese planners, studying intelligence reports of American coastal defenses, believed they could establish beachheads and advance inland before effective resistance could be organized. The target date was set for March 1945, exactly 1 year after the planned invasion of Japan in our timeline. But Japanese expansion came at a cost that few in Tokyo were willing to acknowledge. The occupation of Australia required enormous resources, tying down 300,000 Japanese troops in garrison duties. The naval operations in the Central Pacific stretched Japanese logistics to the breaking point. Most critically, the brutal treatment of civilian populations in occupied territories was creating guerrilla movements that consumed increasing numbers of Japanese forces. In Australia, Aboriginal tribes allied with scattered Australian soldiers to launch hit-and-run attacks against Japanese supply lines. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land, led by a warrior named Mandawi, proved particularly effective at ambushing Japanese patrols in the vast outback. Japanese reprisals were swift and brutal, but they only served to strengthen resistance. Similar patterns emerged across the Pacific. In the Philippines, where Japanese rule had been harsh but tolerable, the expansion of the war led to increasingly draconian occupation policies. The Hikbalahap, the communist-led resistance movement, found new recruits among Filipinos who had initially welcomed Japanese liberation from American colonial rule. By the end of 1944, Japanese forces controlled more territory than any Asian empire in history. Their flag flew over Australia, New Guinea, the Central Pacific, and much of Southeast Asia. But this vast empire was increasingly hollow, defended by overstretched forces facing growing resistance from subjugated populations who had lost all hope of Allied liberation. As 1945 dawned, the leaders of the Japanese Empire faced a crucial decision: consolidate their gains and seek a negotiated peace, or launch the most audacious gamble in military history, a direct assault on the American homeland. The choice they made would determine not just the outcome of the Pacific War, but the shape of the entire world order. The Cold War that never was. A Nazi-Soviet stalemate, the frozen corpse of senior Lieutenant Pavel Volkov lay sprawled in the snow outside Smolensk, his dead eyes staring at the gray February sky. Around him, the detritus of a failed Soviet counterattack told the story of the Eastern Front's new reality. Burned-out T-34 tanks, scattered ammunition boxes, and hundreds of bodies that would remain frozen until spring. It was February 14th, 1945, Valentine's Day, and love had died along with hope in the killing fields of Western Russia. 300 miles to the west, in a heated bunker beneath the ruins of Warsaw, Oberfuhrer Oskar Dirlewanger cleaned his Luger pistol and contemplated the stalemate that had settled over Europe like a shroud. The mad genius of brutality who had terrorized partisan strongholds across Eastern Europe now found himself commanding a static defensive line that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The war of movement that had defined the Eastern Front for 3 years had become a grinding war of attrition that neither side could win. The transformation had begun in October 1944, when German forces advancing toward Moscow encountered something they hadn't expected: effective Soviet resistance. Stalin's desperate gamble, throwing every available man into the defense of the capital, had finally paid dividends. The Red Army, reinforced by factory workers, university students, and even prisoners released from the gulags, had managed to halt the German advance just 20 miles from the Kremlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, standing in the snow-covered trenches outside Tula, watched German artillery pound Soviet positions with methodical precision. "We have stopped them," he radioed to Stalin on February 20th, 1945, "but we cannot push them back. They are too strong, and we are too weak. The front has crystallized." The word crystallized would come to define this new phase of the war. Unlike the fluid battles of 1941 to 1943, where armies advanced and retreated across hundreds of miles, the Eastern Front had frozen into a line of fortifications that neither side could break. German forces, reinforced by 45 divisions from the defunct Atlantic Wall, possessed overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority. But they lacked the manpower to achieve decisive victory over an enemy fighting for its very existence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had mobilized resources that defied comprehension. Every factory, every farm, every school had been converted to support the war effort. Children as young as 14 worked in munitions plants, while grandmothers knitted uniforms for soldiers they would never see again. The Soviet economy had become a machine designed for one purpose: keeping German forces from advancing another inch toward Moscow. Adolf Hitler, studying situation maps in the Wolf's Lair, gradually came to understand what his generals had known for months. Germany could not win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. The mathematics were inexorable. For every German soldier killed or wounded, the Soviets could replace their losses with 3 or 4 men. For every German tank destroyed, Soviet factories produced 2 replacements. The Reich was slowly bleeding to death on the steppes of Russia. The realization led to one of the most cynical diplomatic initiatives in history. On March 15, 1945, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop made secret contact with his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, through intermediaries in neutral Sweden. The message was simple. Germany proposed a negotiated settlement that would divide Eastern Europe between the two totalitarian powers. The proposed division was breathtaking in its scope. Germany would retain control of Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine west of the Dnieper River, and Belarus. The Soviet Union would keep everything east of the line, including Moscow, Leningrad, and the industrial heartland of the Urals. The two powers would establish a demilitarized zone 50 miles wide along their mutual border, monitored by neutral observers from Switzerland and Sweden. Stalin's initial reaction was predictable. Tell the fascist dog that the Soviet Union does not negotiate with criminals. But as reports from the front continued to paint a picture of stalemate, the Georgian dictator began to consider the unthinkable. His generals were exhausted, his people were starving, and his economy was collapsing under the strain of total war. Perhaps a temporary peace was better than national destruction. The secret negotiations conducted in the basement of the Swedish embassy in Moscow would have been impossible in any other timeline. Only the failure of D-Day and the collapse of the Western Alliance had created conditions where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union could seriously discuss dividing Europe between them. The irony was not lost on either side. The two most murderous regimes in history were about to become partners in oppression. The agreement, signed on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, was officially called the Eastern Armistice. Publicly, both sides claimed it was a temporary measure to allow humanitarian aid to reach civilian populations in the war zone. Privately, diplomats on both sides understood it was a de facto partition of Eastern Europe that could last for decades. The terms were complex and brutal in their simplicity. All military operations would cease at midnight on April 30th, 1945. Prisoner exchanges would begin immediately, with both sides agreeing to repatriate captured soldiers within 6 months. Most controversially, both governments agreed to population transfers that would create ethnically homogeneous zones of control. The human cost of these transfers was staggering. Over the summer of 1945, 12 million people were forcibly relocated from their homes. Ethnic Germans living in Soviet-controlled territories were shipped westward in cattle cars reminiscent of Holocaust transports. Slavic populations in German-controlled areas faced a similar fate, herded eastward at gunpoint by SS units that had previously managed concentration camps. Maria Kozlova, a Ukrainian schoolteacher from Kiev, found herself on a train bound for the Soviet interior in June 1945. Her crime was living on the wrong side of the new border. They gave us 30 minutes to pack our lives into a single suitcase, she wrote in a letter smuggled out through the Red Cross. Children were crying, old people were dying, and the guards just laughed. This is what peace looks like. The establishment of the new border required massive engineering projects that rivaled the Atlantic Wall in scope and brutality. Both sides constructed fortifications, minefields, and observation posts that turned the line of division into an impenetrable barrier. The Iron Curtain that Churchill would later describe was not just a metaphor. It was a physical reality of barbed wire, concrete, and death. General Heinz Guderian, now commanding Army Group Center, oversaw the construction of the German defensive line from his headquarters in Minsk. "We are building a wall that will last 1,000 years," he wrote to his wife. Every meter is designed to channel the Bolshevik hordes into killing zones where our machine gunners can cut them down like wheat. Similar preparations were being made on the Soviet side, where Marshal Ivan Konev supervised the construction of fortifications that would make any German advance prohibitively costly. The psychological impact of the armistice was devastating for resistance movements across occupied Europe. Polish Home Army fighters, who had held out in the forest for 3 years, gradually laid down their arms as it became clear that liberation would never come. French partisans, operating in the mountains of the Massif Central, found their ranks thinning as hope died along with their British radio contacts. Perhaps most tragically, the armistice doomed the remaining survivors of the Holocaust. With no prospect of Allied liberation, the Nazi extermination program continued with renewed efficiency. The additional time provided by the Eastern Armistice allowed SS administrators to complete their work in territories that might otherwise have been liberated. By the end of 1945, European Jewry had been virtually eliminated from all German-controlled territories. The new European order that emerged from the armistice was unlike anything in human history. Two totalitarian empires, each controlling roughly half of Europe, faced each other across a fortified border that stretched for 1,500 miles. Trade between the zones was minimal and carefully controlled. Cultural exchange was non-existent. Families separated by the new border lost contact forever, becoming casualties of a peace that was more brutal than war. Winston Churchill, in exile in Canada after Britain's surrender, described the situation in a speech that would become famous. An iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. Behind that line lie all the capitals of Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Bucharest, and Sofia. All are subject to Soviet influence or German control, and the peoples of those ancient states have no voice in their own fate. But this was not the Cold War of our timeline, where democracy and communism faced off across ideological lines. This was something far darker, a world divided between two forms of totalitarianism, each as brutal and oppressive as the other. The absence of democratic alternatives had created a nightmare scenario where millions of people faced a choice between Nazi racial oppression and Soviet class warfare. As 1945 drew to a close, the new European order seemed stable and permanent. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union showed any inclination to resume hostilities. Both had too much to lose and too little to gain from continued warfare. The stalemate that had emerged from the failure of D-Day appeared to be the new normal, a world where freedom had been sacrificed on the altar of realpolitik. But beneath the surface stability, forces were gathering that would soon transform the entire global balance of power. In the deserts of New Mexico, American scientists were preparing to test a weapon that could render armies and borders meaningless. The atomic age was about to dawn, and with it would come a reckoning that neither Hitler nor Stalin could imagine. The world of 1945, a planet under the swastika, the mushroom cloud rose above the Nevada desert like a grotesque flower blooming in fast motion, its deadly petals spreading across the dawn sky. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, standing in the observation bunker 5 miles from Ground Zero, felt the heat wash over his face even through the reinforced glass. It was July 16, 1945, and the Trinity test had just succeeded beyond anyone's wildest nightmares. But as he watched the fireball consume the desert landscape, Oppenheimer wasn't thinking about scientific triumph. He was thinking about the world his creation would soon inherit. A world where democracy hung by a thread and totalitarianism stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The flash of atomic fire illuminated a planet transformed beyond recognition by 13 months of cascading disasters that had begun on the beaches of Normandy. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler stood before a map of the world that showed the true extent of the Nazi Empire's reach. Red swastikas marked German-controlled territories from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Moscow. Never in human history had a single ideology controlled so much of the Earth's surface. But the red flags were only part of the story. Rising sun banners flew over an even vaster Pacific empire that stretched from the Aleutians to Australia. Japanese forces, emboldened by their enemies' failures, had carved out a maritime domain larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. The twin totalitarian powers, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, now controlled more than half the world's population and 3/4 of its industrial capacity. General Douglas MacArthur, standing on the bridge of his flagship anchored off the California coast, studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of Allied defeat so complete it defied comprehension. The Pacific Fleet, once the most powerful naval force in history, had been reduced to fewer than 50 major warships. The Japanese combined fleet, now operating from bases in Australia and the Central Pacific, dominated the world's largest ocean with impunity. They're preparing for Operation Cherry Blossom, MacArthur's intelligence officer reported, referring to the planned Japanese invasion of the American West Coast. Our sources in Tokyo suggest a landing date of August 15th, the anniversary of VJ Day. The irony was bitter. August 15th should have marked Japan's surrender. Instead, it would mark their boldest gamble yet. The mathematical reality facing the United States was stark and terrifying. With Britain under German occupation, the Soviet Union locked in stalemate with Nazi forces, and most of the world's democracies either conquered or cowering in neutrality, America stood virtually alone against enemies who controlled most of the planet's resources. The arsenal of democracy had become a fortress under siege. President Harry Truman, who had inherited the presidency after Roosevelt's death from a stroke in April 1945, faced decisions that would determine not just America's fate, but the survival of democratic government itself. In a secret session with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on August 1st, 1945, he laid out the stark reality. Gentlemen, we have perhaps 6 months before the Japanese attempt to invade the homeland. The atomic bomb is our only hope of avoiding a negotiated surrender. But even the atomic bomb came with terrible risks. German intelligence, led by the brilliant spymaster Reinhard Gehlen, had penetrated the Manhattan Project through a network of agents that included Klaus Fuchs, who was now a double agent feeding information to Berlin as well as Moscow. Hitler's scientists, working with captured uranium from the Belgian Congo and heavy water from occupied Norway, were perhaps months away from their own atomic weapon. The race for nuclear supremacy had become a three-way contest that would determine the fate of civilization. In the Ural Mountains, Soviet scientists under Igor Kurchatov worked frantically to develop weapons that could break the stalemate with Germany. In laboratories hidden beneath the Bavarian Alps, German physicists led by Werner Heisenberg pursued the same deadly goal. And in the deserts of New Mexico, American researchers prepared weapons that might be the last hope for human freedom. The social and cultural transformation of the world was as complete as the political changes. In German-controlled Europe, Nazi racial theories had become the foundation of education, law, and daily life. Children in occupied France learned mathematics by calculating the racial purity of theoretical populations. Universities in conquered Poland taught courses on the scientific basis of Aryan superiority. The accumulated wisdom of 2 millennia of European civilization had been replaced by the primitive mythology of blood and soil. The same pattern played out across the Japanese Empire, where the ideology of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, was imposed on conquered peoples from Australia to Alaska. Aboriginal Australians were forced into re-education camps designed to eliminate their ancient culture and replace it with emperor worship. American prisoners of war in Japanese-occupied territories faced systematic brutalization designed to break their will to resist. But it was the fate of European Jewry that represented the most complete triumph of totalitarian evil. By August 1945, Himmler's expanded final solution had succeeded beyond his most genocidal dreams. The additional time provided by German victory and the Nazi-Soviet stalemate had allowed SS administrators to complete their work of extermination. From the Atlantic to the Urals, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, European Jewish civilization had been not just destroyed but erased from memory. The numbers were beyond human comprehension. 12 million Jews murdered in gas chambers, mass shootings, and medical experiments. But the statistics only hinted at the cultural catastrophe. Libraries that had preserved Hebrew scholarship for centuries were burned. Synagogues that had stood for 1,000 years were demolished. Even the cemeteries were bulldozed, ensuring that future generations would find no trace of the people who had once enriched European civilization immeasurably. Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, the historian who had documented the Warsaw Ghetto's destruction, might have survived in our timeline to bear witness to Nazi crimes. In this darker world, he died in Treblinka on March 15, 1945, taking with him the testimonies he had gathered from thousands of victims. His final words, scrawled on a piece of paper and smuggled out by a Polish guard, were haunting in their simplicity. The world has forgotten us. May God remember what man chose to forget. The economic implications of Axis domination were equally staggering. German-controlled Europe had become a vast industrial complex dedicated to military production and territorial expansion. Slave labor from across the continent fed German factories that produced weapons for the continuing war against Soviet Russia. French engineers designed rockets for the Wehrmacht. Czech workers assembled fighter planes that would soon attack American cities. The Japanese Empire had achieved similar economic integration across the Pacific. Australian iron ore fed Japanese blast furnaces. Petroleum from the Dutch East Indies powered the combined fleet. Filipino laborers constructed fortifications across the Central Pacific that would make any American counteroffensive prohibitively costly. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had become a reality, but one built on oppression and exploitation rather than cooperation. As autumn approached in 1945, the world teetered on the edge of an even greater catastrophe. Japanese forces were massing in the Central Pacific for Operation Cherry Blossom, the invasion of California. German scientists were reportedly close to testing their first atomic weapon. The Soviet Union, pushed to the brink of collapse, was considering the use of chemical weapons that could kill millions. The failure of D-Day had not just changed military history. It had unleashed forces that threatened the very survival of human civilization. In a world where totalitarian powers controlled most of the Earth's surface, where genocide had become state policy, and where atomic weapons threatened to make the planet uninhabitable, the democratic ideals of freedom, equality, and human dignity seemed like relics from a more innocent age. But even in this darkest timeline, hope survived in isolated pockets of resistance. In the mountains of occupied France, a few dozen Maquis fighters continued their hopeless war against German occupation. In the Australian outback, Aboriginal warriors and scattered Allied soldiers harassed Japanese supply lines. In the forests of Eastern Europe, Jewish partisans who had escaped the death camps fought with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose. Their struggles seemed futile against the overwhelming power of the Axis empires. But history has a way of surprising even its most careful observers. As the atomic age dawned over a world dominated by swastikas and rising suns, forces were gathering that would soon shake the foundations of totalitarian power. The question was not whether this dark new world order would face challenges, but whether those challenges would come soon enough to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and humanity's darkest hour was about to begin. If this exploration of alternate history opened your eyes to how fragile our freedoms really are, you're not alone. Here at my YouTube channel, we dive deep into the pivotal moments that shaped our world and the terrifying possibilities that could have changed everything. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive documentaries into history's most critical moments. Like this video if it made you think differently about the price of freedom. Comment below, what other historical what-ifs would you like us to explore? The assassination of Hitler in 1944? What if the atomic bomb hadn't worked? Your suggestions drive our content. Support the channel. Historical research takes time and resources. Consider joining our Patreon for behind-the-scenes content, early access to videos, and input on future topics. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters whose contributions make these in-depth documentaries possible. You're helping preserve and share the stories that shaped our world. Next video, we're exploring another chilling alternate timeline. What if the Spanish flu had never ended? The medical, social, and political consequences of a pandemic that refused to die. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got the world we have today and how quickly it could all change.